Hey there, I'm your imaginary friend. I've got a story for you today by John Buchan. Hope I'm pronouncing that name even approximately correctly. Now, as always, bear in mind that my pronunciations are terrible, and also that sometimes an author will have included something in their work that at the time of writing may have seemed fine to them, but it's not always fine. Now, occasionally I feel that I need to and strengthen that caveat a little bit. And this story does deal somewhat with race memory and takes place in Africa. It's not exactly the unbroken chain, but it's leaning in that direction. This is the Green Wildebeest, Sir Richard Hannay's story. It begins with a quote by Sir Thomas Browne from Religio Medici. "We carry with us the wonders we seek without us. There is all Africa and her prodigies in us." We were talking about the persistence of race qualities, how you might bury a strain for generations under fresh graftings, but the aboriginal sap would someday stir. The obvious instance was the Jew, and Pew had also something to say about the surprises of a tincture of hill blood in the Bahari. Peckweather, the historian, was inclined to doubt. The old stock he held could disappear absolutely, as if by a chemical change, and the end be as remote from the beginnings as, to use his phrase, a ripe gorgonzola from a bucket of new milk. "I don't believe you're ever quite safe," said Sandy Arbuthnot. "You mean that an eminent banker may get up one morning with a strong wish to cut himself shaving in honor of Baal?" "Maybe, but the tradition is more likely to be negative. There are some things that for no particular reason he won't like, some things that specially frighten him. Take my own case. I haven't a scrap of real superstition in me, but I hate crossing a river at night. I fancy a lot of my blackguard ancestors got scuppered at moonlight fords. I believe we're all stuffed full of atavistic fears, and you can't tell how or when a man will crack till you know his breeding." "I think that's about the truth of it," said Hannay, and after the discussion had rambled on for a while, he told us this tale. "Just after the Boer War," he said, "I was on a prospecting job in the northeastern Transvaal. I was a mining engineer with copper as my specialty, and I had always a notion that copper might be found in big quantities in the Zoutpansberg foothills. There was, of course, Messina in the West End, but my thoughts turned rather to the northeast corner, where the berg breaks down to the crook of the Limpopo. I was a young man then, fresh from 2 years campaigning with the Imperial Light Horse, and I was thirsty for better jobs than trying to drive elusive burghers up against barbed wire and blockhouses. When I started out with my mules from Petersburg on the dusty roads to the hills, I think I felt happier than ever before in my life. I had only one white companion, a boy of 22 called Andrew Dupreez. Andrew, not Andries, for he was named after the Reverend Andrew Murray, who had been a great pope among the devout Afrikanders. He came of a rich, Free State farming family, but his particular branch had been settled for 2 generations in the Wakkerstroom region along the upper Pongola. The father was a splendid old fellow with a head like Moses, and he and all the uncles had been on commando, and most of them had had a spell in Bermuda or Ceylon. The boy was a bit of a freak in that stock. He had been precociously intelligent, and had gone to a good school in the Cape, and afterwards to a technical college in Johannesburg. He was as modern a product as the others were survivals, with none of the family religion or family politics, very keen on science, determined to push his way on the Rand, which was the Mecca of all enterprising Afrikanders, and not very sorry that the war should have found him in a place from which it was manifestly impossible to join the family banner. In October 99, he was on his first job in a new mining area in Rhodesia, and as he hadn't much health, he was wise enough to stick there till peace came. I had known him before, and when I ran across him on the Rand, I asked him to come with me, and he jumped at the offer. He had just returned from the Wakkerstroom farm, to which the rest of his clan had been repatriated, and didn't relish the prospect of living in a tin-roofed shanty with a father who read the Bible most of the day to find out why exactly he had merited such misfortune. Andrew was a hard young skeptic, in whom the family piety produced acute exasperation. He was a good-looking boy, always rather smartly dressed, and at first sight you would have taken him for a young American, because of his heavy, hairless chin, his dull complexion, and the way he peppered his ordinary speech with technical and business phrases. There was a touch of the Mongol in his face, which was broad, with high cheekbones, eyes slightly slanted, short, thick nose, and rather full lips. I remembered that I had seen the same thing before in young Boers, and I thought I knew the reason. The Dupree's family had lived for generations close up to the Kaffir borders, and somewhere had got a dash of the tar brush. We had a light wagon with a team of 8 mules and a Cape cart drawn by 4 others. 5 boys went with us, 2 of them Shangans, and 3 Basutos from Militsi's location north of Petersburg. Our road was over the wood bush, and then northeast across the 2 Letabas to the Pufuri River. The countryside was amazingly empty. Bayer's commandos had skirmished among the hills, but the war had never reached the plains. At the same time, it had put a stop to all hunting and prospecting and had scattered most of the native tribes. The place had become, in effect, a sanctuary, and I saw more varieties of game than I had ever seen before south of the Zambezi, so that I wished I were on a hunting trip instead of on a business job. Lions were plentiful, and every night we had to build a skerm for our mules and light great fires, besides which we listened to their eerie serenades. It was early December, and in the wood bush it was the weather of an English June. Even in the foothills, among the wormwood and wild bananas, it was pleasant enough, but when we got out into the plains, it was as hot as Tophet. As far as the eye could reach, the bushveld rolled its scrub like the scrawled foliage a child draws on a slate, with here and there a baobab swimming unsteadily in the glare. For long stretches we were away from water and ceased to see big game, only Kaffir queens and tick birds, and now and then a wild ostrich. Then on the 6th day out from Petersburg we raised a blue line of mountains on the north, which I knew to be the eastern extension of the Zoutpansberg. I had never travelled this country before, and had never met a man who had, so we steered by compass, and by one of the old bad maps of the Transvaal government. That night we crossed the Pufuri, and next day the landscape began to change. The ground rose so that we had a sight of the distant Lebombo hills to the east, and mopani bushes began to appear, a sure sign of a healthier country. That afternoon we were only a mile or 2 from the hills. They were the usual type of berg, which you find everywhere from Natal to the Zambezi, cut sheer with an overhang in many places, but much broken up by kloofs and fissures. What puzzled me was the absence of streams. The ground was as baked as the plains, all covered with aloe and cactus and thorn, with never a sign of water. But for my purpose, the place looked promising. There was that unpleasant metallic green that you find in a copper country, so that everything seemed to have been steeped in a mineral dye, even the brace of doves, which I shot for luncheon. We turned east along the foot of the cliffs, and presently saw a curious feature. A promontory ran out from the berg, connected by a narrow isthmus with the main massif. I suppose the superficial area of the top might have been a square mile or so. The little peninsula was deeply cut into by ravines, and in the ravines tall timber was growing. Also we came to well-grassed slopes dotted with mimosa and syringa bushes. This must mean water at last, for I had never found yellow woods and stinkwoods growing far from a stream. Here was our outspan for the night, and when presently we rounded a corner and looked down into a green cup, I thought I had rarely seen a more habitable place. The sight of fresh green herbage always intoxicated me, after the dust and heat and the ugly greys and umbers of the bushveld. There was a biggish kraal in the bottom, and a lot of goats and leggy Kaffir sheep on the slopes. Children were bringing in the cows for the milking. Smoke was going up from the cooking fires, and there was a cheerful evening hum in the air. I expected a stream, but could see no sign of one. The cup seemed to be as dry as a hollow of the Sussex Downs. Also, though there were patches of mealies and Kaffir corn, I could see no irrigated land. But water must be there. and after we had fixed a spot for our outspan beside a clump of olive woods, I took Andrew and one of our boys and strolled down to make inquiries. I dare say many of the inhabitants of that kraal had never seen a white man before, for our arrival made a bit of a sensation. I noticed that there were very few young men about the place, but an inordinate number of old women. The first sight of us scattered them like plovers, and we had to wait for half an hour, smoking patiently in the evening sun, before we could get into talk with them. Once the ice was broken, however, things went well. They were a decent, peaceable folk, very shy and scared and hesitating, but with no guile in them. Our presents of brass and copper wire and a few tins of preserved meat made a tremendous impression. We bought a sheep from them at a ridiculously small price, and they threw in a basket of green mealies. But when we raised the water question, we struck a snag. There was water, good water, they said, but it was not in any pan or stream. They got it morning and evening from up there. And they pointed to the fringe of a wood under the cliffs where I thought I saw the roof of a biggish rondavel. They got it from their father. They were Shangans, and the word they used was not the ordinary word for chief, but the name for a great priest and medicine man. I wanted my dinner, so I forebode to inquire further. I produced some more Kaffir truck and begged them to present it with my compliments to their father, and to ask for water for 2 white strangers, 5 of their own race, and 12 mules. They seemed to welcome the proposition, and a string of them promptly set off uphill with their big calabashes. As we walked back, I said something foolish to Andrew about having struck a Kaffir Moses who could draw water from the rock. The lad was in a bad temper. "We've struck an infernal rascal who has made a corner in the water supply and bleeds these poor devils. He's the kind of grafter I would like to interview with a sjambok." In an hour, we had all the water we wanted. It stood in a row of calabashes, and beside it the presents I had sent to the provider. The villagers had deposited it and then vanished, and our boys, who had helped them carry it, were curiously quiet and solemnized. I was informed that the father sent the water as a gift to the strangers without payment. I tried to cross-examine one of our Shangans, but he would tell me nothing except that the water had come from a sacred place into which no man could penetrate. He also muttered something about a wildebeest, which I couldn't understand. Now, the Kaffir is the most superstitious of God's creatures. All the way from Petersburg, we'd been troubled by the vivid imaginations of our outfit. They wouldn't sleep in one place because of a woman without a head who haunted it. They dared not go a yard along a particular road after dark because of a spook that traveled it in the shape of a rolling ball of fire. Usually their memories were as short as their fancies were quick, and 5 minutes after their protest they would be laughing like baboons. But that night they seemed to have been really impressed by something. They did not chatter or sing over their supper, but gossiped in undertones, and slept as near Andrew and myself as they dared. Next morning the same array of gourds stood before our outspan, and there was enough water for me to have a tub in my collapsible bath. I don't think I ever felt anything colder. I decided to take a holiday and go shooting. Andrew would stay in camp and tinker up one of the wheels of the mule wagon which had suffered from the bush roads. He announced his intention of taking a walk later and interviewing the water merchant. "For heaven's sake, be careful," I said. "Most likely he's a priest of sorts, and if you're not civil to him, we'll have to quit this country. I make a point of respecting the gods of the heathen." "All you English do," he replied tartly. "That's why you make such a damn mess of handling Kaffirs. But this fellow is a businessman with a pretty notion of cornering public utilities. I'm going to make his acquaintance." I had a pleasant day in that hot, scented wilderness. First I tried the low ground, but found nothing there but some old spoor of kudu and a pow, which I shot. Then I tried the skirts of the berg to the east of the village, and found that the kloofs, which from below looked climbable, had all somewhere a confounded overhang which checked me. I saw no way of getting to the top of the plateau, so I spent the afternoon in exploring the tumbled glacis. There was no trace of copper here, for the rock was reddish granite, but it was a jolly flowery place, with green dells among the crags, and an amazing variety of birds. But I was glad that I had brought a water bottle, for I found no water. It was there all right, but it was underground. I stalked a bushbuck ram and missed him, but I got one of the little buck-like chamois, which the Dutch call klipspringer. With it and the pow strung round my neck, I sauntered back leisurely to supper. As soon as I came in sight of the village, I saw that something had played the deuce with it. There was a great hubbub going on, and all the folk were collected at the end, farthest away from our camp. The camp itself looked very silent. I could see the hobbled mules, but I could see nothing of any of our outfit. I thought it best in these circumstances to make an inconspicuous arrival. So I bore away to my left, crossed the hollow lower down, where it was thick with scrub, and came in on the outspan from the south. It was very silent. The cooking fires had been allowed to go out, though the boys should have been getting ready the evening meal, and there seemed to be not a single black face on the premises. Very uneasy, I made for our sleeping tent, and found Andrew lying on his bed, smoking. "What on earth has happened?" I demanded. "Where are Coys and Clemboy and—" "Quit," he said shortly. "They've all quit." He looked sulky and tired, and rather white in the face, and there seemed to be more the matter with him than ill temper. He would lay down his pipe and press his hand on his forehead like a man with a bad headache. Also, he never lifted his eyes to mine. I dare say I was a bit harsh, for I was hungry, and there were moments when I thought he was going to cry. However, at last I got a sort of story out of him. He'd finished his job on the wagon wheel in the morning, and after luncheon had gone for a walk to the wood above the village at the foot of the cliffs. He wanted to see where the water came from, and to have a word with the man who controlled it. Andrew, as I have told you, was a hard young realist, and by way of reaction from his family, a determined foe of superstition, and he disliked the notion of this priest and his mumbo-jumbo. Well, it seemed that he reached the priest's headquarters. It was the big rondavel we had seen from below, and there was a kind of stockade stretching on both sides, very strongly fenced, so that the only entrance was through the rondavel. He'd found the priest at home, and had, according to his account, spoken to him civilly, and had tried to investigate the water problem. But the old man would have nothing to say to him, and peremptorily refused his request to be allowed to enter the enclosure. By and by Andrew lost his temper, and forced his way in. The priest resisted. There was a scuffle. I dare say Andrew used his sjambok, for a back-veld Dutchman can never keep his hands off a Kaffir. I didn't like the story, but it was no use being angry with a lad who looked like a sick dog. "What is inside? Did you find the water?" I asked. "I hadn't time. It's a thick wood and full of beasts. I tell you, I was scared out of my senses and had to run for my life." "Leopards?" I asked. I'd heard of native chiefs keeping tame leopards. "Leopards be damned. I'd have faced leopards. I saw a wildebeest as big as a house, an old brute, grey in the nozzle, and the rest of it green. Green, I tell you. I took a pot shot at it and ran. When I came out, the whole blasted kraal was howling. The old devil must have roused them. I legged it for home. No, they didn't follow, but in half an hour, all our outfit had cut their stick. Didn't wait to pick up their duds. Oh, hell, I can't talk. Leave me alone." I had laughed in spite of myself. A wildebeest is not ornamental, at the best, but a green one must be a good recipe for the horrors. All the same, I felt very little like laughing. Andrew had offended the village, and its priest played havoc with the brittle nerves of our own boys, and generally made the place too hot to hold us. He had struck some kind of native magic, which had frightened him to the bone for all his skepticism. The best thing I could do seemed to be to try and patch up a peace with the water merchant. So I made a fire and put on a kettle to boil, stayed my hunger with a handful of biscuits, and started out for the rondavel. But first I saw that my revolver was loaded, for I fancied that there might be trouble. It was a calm, bright evening, but up from the hollow where the kraal lay there rose a buzz like angry wasps. No one interfered with me. Indeed, I met no one until I presented myself at the rondavel door. It was a big empty place, joined to the stockades on both sides, and opposite the door was another which opened on to a dull green shade. I never saw a skirm so stoutly built. There was a palisade of tall, pointed poles, and between them a thick wall of wait-a-bit thorns, interlaced with a scarlet-flowered creeper. It would have taken a man with an axe half a day to cut a road through. The only feasible entrance was by the rondavel. An old man was squatted on an earthen floor, which had been so pounded and beaten that it looked like dark polished stone. His age might have been anything above 70 from the whiteness of his beard, but there seemed a good deal of bodily strength left in him, for the long arms which rested on his knees were muscular. His face was not the squat face of the ordinary Kaffir, but high-boned and regular, like some types of well-bred Zulu. Now that I think of it, there was probably Arab blood in him. He lifted his head at the sound of my steps, and by the way he looked at me, I knew that he was blind. There he sat, without a word, every line of his body full of dejection and tragedy. I had suddenly a horrible feeling of sacrilege, that young fool Andrew should have lifted his hand upon an old man and a blind man, and outraged some harmless taboo, seemed to me an abominable thing. I felt that some holiness had been violated, something ancient and innocent, cruelly insulted. At that moment there was nothing in the world I wanted so much as to make restitution. I spoke to him, using the Shangaan word, which means both priest and king. I told him that I had been away hunting, and had returned to find that my companion had made bad mischief. I said that Andrew was very young, and that his error had been only the foolishness and hot-headedness of youth. I said, and my voice must have shown him that I meant it, that I was cut to the heart by what had happened, that I bowed my head in the dust in contrition, and that I asked nothing better than to be allowed to make atonement. Of course, I didn't offer money. I would as soon have thought of offering a tip to the Pope. He never lifted his head, so I said it all over again, and the second time it was genuine pleading. I'd never spoken like that to a Kaffir before, but I could not think of that old figure as a Kaffir, but as the keeper of some ancient mystery which a rude hand had outraged. He spoke at last. "There can be no atonement," he said. "Wrong has been done, and on the wrongdoer must fall the penalty." The words were wholly without menace. Rather, he spoke as if he were an unwilling prophet of evil. He was there to declare the law, which he could not alter if he wanted. I apologized, I protested, I pled, I fairly groveled. I implored him to tell me if there was no way in which the trouble could be mended. But if I had offered him £1,000,000, I don't believe that old fellow would have changed his tone. He seemed to feel, and he made me feel it too, that a crime had been committed against the law of nature, and that it was nature, not man, that would avenge it. He wasn't in the least unfriendly. Indeed, I think he rather liked the serious way I took the business, and realized how sorry I was. His slow sentences came out without a trace of bitterness. It was this that impressed me so horribly. He was like an old stone oracle, repeating the commands of the god he served. I could make nothing of him, though I kept at it till the shadows had lengthened outside, and it was almost dark within the rondavel. I wanted to ask him at least to help me get back my boys, and to make our peace with the village, but I simply could not get the words out. The atmosphere was too solemn to put a practical question like that. I was turning to go away, when I looked at the door on the far side. Owing to the curious formation of the cliffs, the sinking sun had only now caught the high treetops, and some ricochet of light made the enclosure brighter than when I first arrived. I felt suddenly an overwhelming desire to go inside. "Is it permitted, Father," I said, "to pass through that door?" To my surprise, he waved me on. "It is permitted," he said, "for you have a clean heart." Then he added a curious thing. "What was there is there no more. It has gone to the fulfilling of the law." It was with a good deal of trepidation that I entered that uncanny enceinte. I remembered Andrew's terror, and I kept my hand on my revolver, for I had a notion that there might be some queer fauna inside. There was light in the upper air, but below it was a kind of olive-green dusk. I was afraid of snakes, also of tiger cats, and there was Andrew's Green Wildebeest. The place was only a couple of acres in extent, and though I walked very cautiously, I soon had made the circuit of it. The skirm continued in a half-moon on each side till it met the sheer wall of the cliffs. The undergrowth was not very thick, and out of it grew tall, straight trees, so that the wood seemed like some old pagan grove. When one looked up, the mulberry sunset sky showed in patches between the feathery tops. But where I walked, it was very dark. There was not a sign of life in it, not a bird or beast, not the crack of a twig or stir in the bushes. All was as quiet and dead as a crypt. Having made the circuit, I struck diagonally across, and presently came on what I had been looking for, a pool of water. The spring was nearly circular, with a diameter of perhaps 6 yards, and what amazed me was that it was surrounded by a parapet of hewn stone. In the centre of the grove there was a little more light, and I could see that stonework had never been made by Kaffir hands. Evening is the time when water comes to its own. It sleeps in the day, but it has its own strange life in the darkness. I dipped my hand in it, and it was as cold as ice. There was no bubbling in it, but there seemed to be a slow, rhythmical movement, as if fresh currents were always welling out of the deeps, and always returning. I've no doubt that it would have been crystal clear if there'd been any light. But as I saw it, it was a surface of darkest jade, opaque, impenetrable, swaying to some magic impulse from the heart of the earth. It is difficult to explain just the effect it had on me. I'd been solemnized before, but this grove and fountain gave the abject, shapeless fear of a child. I felt that somehow I had strayed beyond the reasonable world. The place was clean against nature. It was early summer, so these dark aisles should have been alive with moths and flying ants and all the thousand noises of night. Instead, it was utterly silent and lifeless, dead as a stone except for the secret pulsing of the cold waters. I'd had quite enough. It was an absurd thing to confess, but I bolted, shuffled through the undergrowth and back into the rondavel, where the old man still sat like Buddha on the floor. "You have seen?" he asked. "I have seen," I said, "but I do not know what I've seen. Father, be merciful to foolish youth." He repeated again the words that had chilled me before. "What was there has gone to fulfill the law." I ran all the way back to our outspan and took some unholy tosses on the road, for I'd got it into my head that Andrew was in danger. I don't think I ever believed in his Green Wildebeest, but he'd been positive that the place was full of animals, and I knew for a fact that it was empty. Had some fearsome brute been unloosed on the world? I found Andrew in our tent, and the kettle I had put on to boil empty and the fire out. The boy was sleeping heavily with a flushed face. I saw what had happened. He was practically a teetotaler, but he had chosen to swallow a good third of one of our 4 bottles of whiskey. The compulsion must have been pretty strong which drove him to drink. After that, our expedition went from bad to worse. In the morning there was no water to be had, and I didn't see myself shouldering a calabash and going back to the grove. Also, our boys did not return, and not a soul in the kraal would come near us. Indeed, all night they had kept up a most distressing racket, wailing and beating little drums. There was no use staying on, and for myself I had a strong desire to get out of the neighborhood. The experience of the night before had left an aftertaste of disquiet in my mind, and I wanted to flee from I knew not what. Andrew was obviously a sick man. We did not carry clinical thermometers in those days, but he certainly had fever on him. So we inspanned after breakfast, and a heavy job trekking is when you have to do all the work for yourself. I drove the wagon and Andrew the Cape cart, and I wondered how long he would be able to sit on his seat. My notion was that by going east, we might be able to hire fresh boys and start prospecting in the hill country above the bend of the Limpopo. But the word had gone out against us. You know the way in which Kaffirs send news for 100 miles as quick as the telegraph, by drum taps or telepathy. Explain it any way you like. Well, we struck a big kraal that afternoon, but not a word would they say to us. Indeed, they were actually threatening, and I had to show my revolver and speak pretty stiffly before we got off. It was the same next day, and I grew nervous about our provisions, for we couldn't buy anything, not a chicken or an egg or a mealie cob. Andrew was a jolly companion. He'd relapsed into the primeval lout, and his manners were those of a caveman. If he'd not been patently suffering, I would have found it hard to keep my temper. Altogether, it was a bright lookout, and to crown all, on the 3rd morning, Andrew went down like a log with the worst bout of malaria I have ever seen. That fairly put the lid on it. I thought it was going to be Blackwater, and all my irritation at the boy vanished in my anxiety. There was nothing for it but to give up the expedition and make the best speed possible to the coast. I made for Portuguese territory, and that evening got to the Limpopo. Happily, we struck a more civil brand of native who had not heard of our performances, and I was able to make a bargain with the headman of the village who undertook to take charge of our outfit till it was sent for, and sold us a big native boat. I hired 4 lusty fellows as rowers, and next morning we started down the river. We spent a giddy 5 days before I planted Andrew in the hospital at Lorenzo Marquez. The sickness was not blackwater, thank God, but it was a good deal more than ordinary malaria. Indeed, I think there was a touch of brain fever in it. Curiously enough, I was rather relieved when it came. I'd been scared by the boy's behavior in the first 2 days. I thought that the old priest had actually laid some curse on him. I remembered how the glade in the well had solemnized even me, and I considered that Andrew, with a Kaffir strain somewhere in his ancestry, was probably susceptible to something which left me cold. I'd knocked too much about Africa to be a dogmatic skeptic about the mysteries of the heathen. But this fever seemed to explain it. He'd been sickening for it. That was why he'd behaved so badly to the old man, and had come back babbling about a green wildebeest. I knew that the beginnings of fever often make a man light-headed, so that he loses all self-control and gets odd fancies. All the same, I didn't quite convince myself. I couldn't get out of my head the picture of the old man and his ominous words, or that empty grove under the sunset. I did my best for the boy, and before we reached the coast the worst had passed. A bed was made for him in the stern, and I had to watch him by night and day to prevent him going overboard among the crocodiles. He was apt to be violent, for in his madness he thought he was being chased, and sometimes I had all I could do to keep him in the boat. He would scream like a thing demented, and plead and curse, and I noticed as a queer thing that his ravings were never in Dutch, but always in Kaffir, mostly the Sesotho, which he had learned in his childhood. I expected to hear him mention the Green Wildebeest, but to my comfort he never uttered the name. He gave no clue to what frightened him, but it must have been a full-sized terror, for every nerve in his body seemed to be quivering. I didn't care to look at his eyes. The upshot was that I left him in bed in hospital, as weak as a kitten. But with the fever gone, and restored to his right mind, he was again the good fellow I had known, very apologetic and grateful. So with an easy conscience, I arranged for the retrieving of my outfit and returned to the Rand. Well, for 6 months I lost sight of Andrew. I had to go to Namaqualand, and then up to the copper country of Barotseland, which wasn't as easy a trek as it is today. I had 1 letter from him, written from Johannesburg, not a very satisfactory epistle, for I gathered that the boy was very unsettled. He had quarrelled with his family, and he didn't seem to be contented with the job he had got in the gold fields. As I had known him, he had been a sort of schoolbook industrious apprentice, determined to get on in the world, and not in the least afraid of a dull job and an uncongenial company. This letter was full of small grouses. He wanted badly to have a talk with me, thought of chucking his work and making a trip north to see me, and he ended with an underlined request that I should telegraph when I was coming down country. As it happened, I had no chance just then of sending a telegram, and later I forgot about it. By and by, I finished my tour and was at the falls, where I got a local Rhodesian paper. From it I had news of Andrew, with a vengeance. There were columns about a murder in the Bushveld. 2 men had gone out to look for Kruger's treasure, and one had shot the other. And to my horror I found that the one who was now lying in Pretoria jail under sentence of death was my unhappy friend. You remember the wild yarns after the Boer War about a treasure of gold which Kruger in his flight to the coast had buried somewhere in the Salati country. That, of course, was all nonsense. The wily ex-president had long before seen the main funds safe in a European bank. But I dare say some of the officials had got away with treasury balances, and there may have been bullion cached in the Bushveld. Anyhow, every scallywag south of the Zambezi was agog about the business, and there was no end of expeditions, which never found a single Transvaal sovereign. Well, it seemed that 2 months before, Andrew and a Dutchman called Smit had started out to try their luck, and somewhere on the Olifants the 2 had gone out one evening, and only one had returned. Smit was found by the native boys with a hole in his head, and it was proved that the bullet came from Andrew's rifle, which he had been carrying when the 2 set out. After that, the story became obscure. Andrew had been very excited when he returned, and declared that he had done it at last. But when Smit's body was found, he denied that he had shot him. But it was clear that Smit had been killed by Andrew's sporting .303, and the natives swore that the men had been constantly quarreling, and that Andrew had always shown a very odd temper. The Crown Prosecutor argued that the two believed they had found treasure, and that Andrew had murdered Smith in cold blood to prevent his sharing. The defense seemed to be chiefly the impossibility of a guilty man behaving as Andrew had behaved, and the likelihood of his having fired at a beast in the dark and killed his companion. It sounded to me very thin, and the jury did not believe it, for their verdict was willful murder. I knew that it was simply incredible that Andrew could have committed the crime. Men are queer cattle, and I wouldn't have put even murder past certain fairly decent fellows I knew. But this boy was emphatically not one of them. Unless he had gone stark mad, I was positive that he could never have taken human life. I knew him intimately, in the way you know a fellow you have lived alone with for months, and that was one of the things I could bank on. All the same, it seemed clear that he had shot Smith. I sent the longest telegram I've ever sent in my life to a Scotch lawyer in Johannesburg called Dalgleish, whom I believed in, telling him to move heaven and earth to get a reprieve. He was to see Andrew and wire me details about his state of mind. I thought then that temporary madness was probably our best line, and I believed myself that that was the explanation. I longed to take the train forthwith to Pretoria, but I was tied by the heels till the rest of my outfit came in. I was tortured by the thought that the hanging might already have taken place, for that wretched newspaper was a week old. In 2 days I got Dalglash's reply. He had seen the condemned man and had told him that he came for me. He reported that Andrew was curiously peaceful and apathetic, and not very willing to talk about the business, except to declare his innocence. Dalgleish thought him not quite right in his mind, but he had been already examined, and the court had rejected the plea of insanity. He sent his love to me and told me not to worry. I stirred up Dalgleish again and got a further reply. Andrew admitted that he had fired the rifle, but not at Smith. He had killed something, but what it was he would not say. He did not seem to be in the least keen to save his neck. When I reached Bulawayo, on my way south, I had a brainwave, but the thing seemed so preposterous that I could hardly take it seriously. Still, I daren't neglect any chance, so I wired again to Dalgleish to try to have the execution postponed until he got hold of the priest who lived in the burg above the Pufuri. I gave him full directions how to find him. I said that the old man had laid some curse on Andrew, and that might explain his state of mind. After all, demoniacal possession must be equivalent in law to insanity. But by this time I had become rather hopeless. It seemed a futile thing to be wiring this rigmarole when every hour was bringing the gallows nearer. I left the railroad at Mafeking, for I thought I could save the long circuit by Dar by tracking across the country. I would have done better to stick to the train, for everything went wrong with me. I had a breakdown at the drift of the Silas River and had to wait a day in Rustenburg, and I had trouble again at Commando Neck, so that it was the evening of the third day before I reached Pretoria. As I feared, it was all over. They told me in the hotel that Andrew had been hanged that morning. I went back to Johannesburg to see Dalgleish with a cold horror at my heart and complete mystification in my head. The devil had taken an active hand in things and caused a hideous miscarriage of justice. If there had been anybody I could blame, I would have felt better, but the fault seemed to lie only with the crookedness of fate. Dalgleish could tell me little. Smith had been the ordinary scalawag, not much of a fellow, and no great loss to the world. The puzzle was why Andrew wanted to go with him. The boy in his last days had been utterly apathetic, bore no grudge against anybody, appeared at peace with the world, but didn't seem to want to live. The predicant who visited him daily could make nothing of him. He appeared to be sane enough, but beyond declaring his innocence, was not inclined to talk, and gave no assistance to those who were trying to get a reprieve, scarcely took any interest in it. He had asked repeatedly for me, and had occupied his last days in writing me a long letter, which was to be delivered unopened into my hand. Dalgleish gave me the thing, 7 pages, in Andrew's neat calligraphy, and in the evening on his stope I read it. It was like a voice speaking to me out of the grave, but it was not the voice I knew. Gone was the enlightened, commercially minded young man who had shed all superstition and had a dapper explanation for everything in heaven and earth. It was a crude boy who had written those pages, a boy in whose soul old Calvinistic terrors had been awakened, and terrors older still, out of primordial African shadows. He'd committed great sin. That was the point he insisted upon, and by this sin he had set free something awful to prey on the world. At first it seemed sheer raving mania to me, but as I mused on it, I remembered my own feelings in that empty grove. I had been solemnized, and this boy, with that in his blood which was not in mine, had suffered a cataclysmic spiritual experience. He did not dwell on it, but his few sentences were eloquent in their harsh intensity. He had struggled. He had tried to make light of it, to forget it, to despise it, but it rode him like a nightmare. He thought he was going mad. I had been right about that touch of brain fever. As far as I could make it out, he believed that from that outraged sanctuary something real and living had gone forth, something at any rate of flesh and blood. But this idea may not have come to him till later, when his mind had been for several months in torture, and he had lost the power of sleep. At first, I think, his trouble was only an indefinite haunting, a sense of sin and impending retribution. But in Johannesburg, the malaise had taken concrete form. He believed that through his act something awful was at large, with infinite power for evil, evil not only against the wrongdoer himself, but against the world. And he believed that it might still be stopped, that it was still in the eastern bush. So crude a fancy showed how his normal intelligence had gone to bits. He had tumbled again into the black velvet world of his childhood. He decided to go and look for it. That was where the tough white strain in him came out. He might have a Kafir's blind terrors, but he had the frontier bower's cast-iron courage. If you think of it, it needed a pretty stout heart to set out to find a thing, the thought of which set every nerve quivering. I confess I didn't like to contemplate that lonely, white-faced, tormented boy. I think he knew that tragedy must be the end of it. But he had to face up to that and take the consequences of it. He heard of Smith's expedition and took a half share in it. Perhaps the fact that Smith had a baddish reputation was part of the attraction. He didn't want as companion a man with whom he had anything in common, for he had to think his own thoughts and follow his own course. Well, you know the end of it. In his letter he said nothing about the journey, except that he had found what he sought. I can readily believe that the two did not agree very well, the one hungry for mythical treasure, the other with a problem which all the gold in Africa could not solve. Somewhere, somehow, down in the Salati bushveld, his incubus took bodily form, and he met, or thought he met, the thing which his impiety had released. I suppose we must call it madness. He shot his comrade and thought he had killed an animal. If they had looked next morning, they would have found the spoor, he wrote. Smith's death didn't seem to trouble him at all. I don't think he quite realized it. The thing that mattered for him was that he had put an end to a terror, in some way made atonement. Goodbye, and don't worry about me, were the last words. I'm quite content. I sat a long time thinking while the sun went down over the Magaliesberg. A gramophone was grinding away on an adjacent stope, and the noise of the stamps on the rand came like faraway drums. People at that time used to quote some Latin phrase about a new thing always coming out of Africa. I thought that it was not the new things in Africa that mattered so much as the old things. I proposed to revisit that berg above the Pufuri and have a word with the priest, but I did not get a chance till the following summer, when I trekked down the Limpopo from Main Drift. I didn't like the job, but I felt bound to have it out with that old man, for Andrew's sake. You see, I wanted something more to convince the Walkerstrom household that the boy had not been guilty, as his father thought, of the sin of Cain. I came around the corner of the berg one January evening, after a day of blistering heat, and looked down on the cup of green pasture. One glance showed me that there was not going to be any explanation with the priest. A bit of the cliff had broken away, and the rock fall had simply blotted out the grove and the rondavel. A huge mass of debris sloped down from halfway up the hill, and buried under it were the tall trees through which I had peered up at the sky. Already it was feathered with thorn bush and grasses. There were no patches of crops on the sides of the cup, and crumbling mud walls were all that remained of the kraal. The jungle had flowed over the village, and when I entered it, great moonflowers sprawled on the rubble, looking in the dusk like ghosts of a vanished race. There was one new feature in the place. The landslip must have released the underground water, for a stream now flowed down the hollow. Beside it, in a meadow full of agapanthus and arum lilies, I found 2 Australian prospectors. One of them, he'd been a Melbourne bank clerk, had a poetic soul. Nice little place, he said. Not littered up with blackfellows. If I were on a homesteading job, I reckon I'd squat here.